Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 6 of my series, The Formation of the United States of America, Ratification of the Constitution. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia had disagreed over a number of issues. In particular, the nature of the legislature, but they had finally accepted a lower house with directly elected representatives and an upper house where each state had 2 members. Tempers had frayed towards the end, so several of the later clauses were vague, especially Congress's right to levy and collect taxes in order to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, and the impeachment of the president for bribery, treason, and other crimes and misdemeanors. Despite the clear need for a Bill of Rights, none of the delegates had the necessary energy for more debate, so it was simply ignored. The entire convention had lasted for 4 months, and a sizable number of delegates had failed to make it to the end, but the remaining delegates had finally hammered out a constitution that would create a new nation, the United States of America. Well, if a minimum of 9 states voted to ratify the Constitution. The Confederation Congress opened soon after the convention ended. 10 of the delegates were also members of Congress, so they were now able to take their seats in Congress. Since they made up nearly a third of the 33 delegates who attended that session, their presence was needed. Even so, only 11 of the 13 states could vote, since Rhode Island refused to send any delegates and Maryland's delegation did not achieve quorum. Hoping to achieve their momentum, the delegates proposed that Congress immediately approve the release of the proposed Constitution to the state legislatures for ratification. After 3 days of debate, Congress agreed to transmit the proposed Constitution to the ratifying conventions held by the individual states, but refused to approve the Constitution. Regardless, the states could now start to organize their conventions. The process attracted attention because it was the first national event that occurred across all of the states. The Declaration of Independence was debated and voted on in Philadelphia, then announced to the new nation. It is important to mention that a sense of crisis and the realization that the current Confederation was inadequate to deal with the situation had prompted the convention. Then, there had been 4 long months of silence, and suddenly rumors were spreading of a completely new government. Following the announcement of the new Constitution, people either sided with the Federalists, who advocated for the ratification of the Constitution, or the Anti-Federalists, who opposed ratification. The Federalists had a key advantage since the majority of newspapers supported ratification because the newspapers were urban and cities depended on trade, which would be boosted by a stronger government. Having spent months arguing over the new Constitution, the convention delegates would be at an advantage in any debate. George Mason and Elbridge Gerry would lead the struggle against the Constitution, aided by Luther Martin, John Lansing, and Robert Yates. The campaign for ratification would be led by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Rufus King, William Johnson, Gouverneur Morris, Henry Lee, John Jay, William Dwyer, and Robert Livingston, who coordinated the efforts in their respective states. Recognizing that a coherent defense of the proposed Constitution was needed, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay agreed to draft one in a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, writing under the name Publius. The essays were written fast and often sent to the printer without time for editing. Hamilton and Madison did most of the work, a mind-boggling accomplishment since Hamilton was also working full-time as a lawyer. Despite the later fame of the Federalist Papers, they were not especially influential during the ratification debate. Publication of the essays was largely confined to New York, and only 24 of the 85 essays were published in newspapers outside of New York State. The majority of the essays were published between October 1787 and April 1788, so only the earlier essays could have been read while people were still debating ratification. The collected editions had more influence, but the first volume was only published in March 1788, and the second appeared in late May. It needs to be made clear that this was not a coherent debate, but a series of arguments, responses, and counter-responses that were published in different papers with different readerships. Moreover, the sheer size and complexity of the material meant that they were overwhelming to the average reader, unlike the more accessible Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Still, they proved useful to many Federalist delegates during the various state conventions. There was no equivalent anti-Federalist version of the Federalist Papers, partially because no one could match Hamilton's output, but also the anti-Federalists argued from the perspectives of their individual states, leaving the national argument to Publius, basically Hamilton. A key issue was that the anti-Federalists were divided. A few, like Luther Martin, Robert Yates, and John Lansing, thought that the new Constitution had too many flaws and should simply be rejected, but many other opponents, including George Mason and Elbridge Gerry, merely wanted amendments. In fact, much of the opposition to the convention during the ratification process would have disappeared if the Federalists had announced at the beginning that they would introduce a Bill of Rights to preserve the hard-won rights that people were used to, including freedom of religion, free speech, and trial by jury. Speaking of a Bill of Rights, religious dissenters, in particular Baptists, opposed ratification since they had already suffered a great deal of persecution from established churches and worried that the lack of religious rights would mean a return to persecution. For example, Baptists had struggled for years to win the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom and were understandably reluctant to support a new national government that did not have a similar provision. A smaller number of devout Protestants opposed ratification out of fear that the lack of any religious test to hold federal office would allow Roman Catholics or Jews or atheists to gain office. Neither George Washington nor Benjamin Franklin played a direct role in the ratification process in their respective states, even though Franklin had been elected to another term as state president. Both men preferred to be above the day-to-day struggle, and neither man enjoyed arguments or personal attacks. Instead, they lent their reputations and otherwise left the actual debate to James Wilson in Pennsylvania and James Madison in Virginia. Still, Washington maintained a lively correspondence with his allies. In fact, an extract from a letter to a supporter was printed in over 50 newspapers. Newspapers constantly mentioned Washington's name as a reason for their readers to support the new Constitution, and people expected that he would lead the new government. While Washington's claims to have embraced his retirement ring hollow, he genuinely loved agriculture. He also genuinely loved politics. Pennsylvania's legislature was the first to examine the new Constitution. Its ratification convention started in late November, followed by Delaware and New Jersey in early December. While James Wilson had played a key role in the 3/5 compromise during the Constitutional Convention, he was also a strong opponent of slavery. During Pennsylvania's ratification convention, he defended the Constitution by pointing out that in the current Confederation, each individual state could import slaves for as long as it wanted, but the Constitution had set a cutoff date where Congress would have the authority to prohibit importation after 1808. He wished that abolition would happen sooner, but it might never happen under Confederation. Furthermore, new states would be formed under Congress, and slavery would not be permitted in those states, which sadly is not exactly what happened. But Wilson made a good case for a compromise that at least offered the potential for a better future. The pro-ratification supporters suppressed a record of the opposition during the debates, so the official journal of the convention, published with public funds, records the votes but ignores motions made by critics. Opposition to ratification was led by William Findley and Robert Whitehill, representatives from the frontier region, who were introduced in episode 1. It soon became clear that the convention would be a formality when Whitehill proposed that the convention be dissolved temporarily into a committee of the whole, which would allow the delegates to have an open debate without worrying that their views would be recorded. But it was rejected 44-24. In fact, almost all of the votes would have roughly the same result, so the members had already made up their minds and did not change them during the convention. Instead, there was a lot of oratory for the press, but little attempt at persuasion, which must have been unbearable to sit through. Delaware was actually the first state to ratify the Constitution, followed by Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Georgia, giving the ratification movement momentum, but the true degree of support for ratification is unknown. Aside from Pennsylvania, which had voted 46 to 23 in favor, the other three conventions were unanimous, but none left detailed records of the debates. Delaware and New Jersey were small states that knew they could not survive alone. Georgia's ratification is not surprising, since the residents of Georgia had encountered fierce resistance from the natives who opposed the expansion into their lands, so membership of a new nation promised the resources to overcome that resistance. The Georgia Convention ended on January 5th, the third day of the Connecticut Convention, and the Massachusetts Convention would start a week later. It would be followed by New Hampshire on February 13th, then there would be nothing until Maryland started on April 21st, then Virginia on June 2nd, and North Carolina on July 21st. 4 states had voted in favor, none against, but there was no guarantee that it would pass among the rest. The Connecticut Convention had no official record, and while newspapers published reports of debates, they only presented Federalist speeches. While this was far from impartial, it does show that the Federalists dominated in the state, which was confirmed when ratification passed 128 to 40 on January 9th, further swelling the tide in favor of ratification. Connecticut wanted to avoid economic dependence on its much larger neighbor New York, so it was attracted by the fact that foreign commerce would be regulated by the new government. With a record of 5 for 5, it would have been natural to presume that the winning streak would continue in Massachusetts. In fact, Massachusetts mattered because it was the first state that had genuine opposition to ratification, so a failure to ratify would strengthen opposition in other states. Aware that Sam Adams was likely to oppose ratification, hundreds of artisans in Boston held a meeting that endorsed ratification and then accompanied Paul Revere as he delivered the resolution to Adams. The artisans' support is easily explained. They hoped that a federal government could reopen trade with England, which would restart the stagnant economy in the state. The endorsement appeared to work since Adams remained silent during the convention. An additional factor was that more than 50 towns in the heart of Shays' revolt were too poor to send delegates to the convention. Given their anti-federalist perspective, they likely would have ensured defeat of ratification. Held in the Congregational Church, the Massachusetts Convention had the greatest national coverage of the entire ratification process, since it provided reporters with seats to take notes, and accounts of the debates were not only printed in Massachusetts newspapers, but in 51 newspapers in other states. The galleries could hold 600 to 800 people and were always full. The Federalist strategy was to delay the final vote until they were confident that they had a majority. Vocal opponent Elbridge Gerry was invited to attend, even though he was not a delegate, but found that he could not speak unless he was asked a question. So he sat for 3 days straight, straining to talk until someone finally did. Even then, it was only one question, and he then had an altercation with another delegate and finally left the convention. Victory was far from guaranteed, so Governor John Hancock would be decisive. It seems likely that the Federalists promised to support Hancock in the next election for governor in exchange for his support for ratification. Displaying a remarkable sense of drama, he appeared near the end of the convention bundled up and lying on a bed. Living up to his side of the bargain, Hancock proposed that the Constitution be ratified without qualifications and that the convention press its representatives in Congress to obtain 9 amendments. In the end, Hancock's support was enough to ensure that ratification passed narrowly, 187 to 168, and he received sufficient Federalist support to win re-election as governor. This brought the total number of ratifications to 6, and the next 3 state conventions were New Hampshire, Maryland, and South Carolina, which were likely to vote in favor, giving the Federalists the 9 states required for ratification, making it difficult for the remaining states to oppose an already settled matter. The majority of elected delegates to the Maryland Convention were openly Federalist, so they used the majority to arrange a speedy vote, claiming that extended debates were unnecessary since the issue had already been debated during the elections for delegates. Therefore, the Constitution would be debated as a whole rather than clause by clause. The convention started on April 23rd and voted on April 26th, approving ratification 63-11, so the score was now 7-0. The legislature in South Carolina was controlled by the settled areas of Charleston, Georgetown, and Beaufort, which had 143 delegates, and the backcountry areas had 93 delegates, even though they had nearly 4 times as many people. Worse, the convention would be held in Charleston, making it hard for backcountry delegates to travel there. South Carolina needed help with defense, and it had a large state debt, which would hopefully become the responsibility of the new government. When news arrived of Maryland's ratification, opponents made a motion to adjourn the convention until Virginia had decided so they could follow its lead, but the proposal was defeated 135-89. 2 days later, the convention voted and ratification passed 149-73, with a clear regional division since most of the no votes came from backcountry delegates. Victories in Maryland and South Carolina made the score 8-0, but the organizers of the New Hampshire Convention were forced to postpone it from February to June. Copies of the Constitution had been sent to the towns for people to read when they selected their delegates. Clearly, people saw something they did not like, since 26 of the 100 towns instructed their delegates to vote no, while a mere 4 towns instructed their delegates to vote yes. When the delegates arrived at the convention, the Federalists soon discovered that a no vote was very likely. The simple solution was to postpone the vote, which passed 56-51, adjourning until June. The hope was that the newly convinced delegates could persuade their constituents to accept ratification by then. However, the adjournment signaled weakness, inspiring opponents of ratification in other states. To sum up, the Federalists initially dominated the ratification process, winning 8 ratification conventions in a row, where the only close race was in Massachusetts. Since the Constitution would be ratified after 9 state conventions voted in favor, ratification appeared inevitable, until the organizers of the New Hampshire Convention postponed the convention because they feared they would lose, which was a problem since ratification was already unlikely in the other states. I will discuss the challenges of the remaining state conventions in next episode. Thanks for listening.